Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session on gender equality in agriculture and food security. I have the unenviable task of trying to energize you all at the end of 2 days of very stimulating conversations. We all know gender equality is important in its own right, but it is also important and critical for achieving food and nutrition security. Evidence has shown a strong correlation between gender inequality and hunger. The most unequal countries also have the highest levels of food and nutrition insecurity. And we also know that women are disproportionately affected by poverty. They have lower social status in a lot of countries. They have less control over their lives and are less likely to have control over resources. But the other thing that we know is that women are powerful agents of change for themselves, their families, and their communities. And women like Winnie, who was here earlier, are a great example of that. So the Canadian International Food Security Research Fund operated on the feminist principle that women have a right to participate in the decisions, in the activities, and in the management of the resources that affect them. We integrated gender both in our research processes as well as the content of the research. We integrated gender throughout the project cycle. One of the things you might not know is that all the projects that have presented since yesterday, and even those that were not here, all had a gender strategy. They all carried out a gender analysis. They used that evidence from the gender analysis to inform development of innovations, whether those innovations were technologies, whether they were practices, whether they were business models to link farmers to markets. But a lot of those projects also had strategic gender research questions that they were analyzing. Some of them, led by gender researchers, analyzed the underlying gender and social norms that cause inequalities. They used participatory approaches to engage women, men in addressing those social norms. All the projects targeted and reached women as producers, as business owners, and as consumers, with innovations, with information, with skills. Over 700,000 women were directly engaged in developing and testing some of the innovations we've been hearing about. 78% of these projects increased women's access to knowledge, to skills, and to resources. As you have seen since yesterday, some of the innovations directly benefited women, including reducing their drudgery. We saw that from the millets yesterday. Improved the nutrition of women and girls. We saw that earlier today with the double fortified salt. But also increased access to resources such as capital, income, land, credit, and inputs. What is also very exciting for me is some of those projects, 33% of those projects empowered women, addressing harmful social norms, increasing women's control over resources, and increasing women's voice and leadership in their households and in their communities. For me, overall, CIFSRF has been a clear example of research that works for women. But we've also learned some lessons. We've learned the need to have a theory of change on how women's empowerment and how gender equality happens. We've learned the need for capacity building. We trained over 400 researchers on gender. including the vaccinologists and the agronomists. All of them today can tell you what gender means. A lot of them didn't know that when we started. But we've also learned the need to move beyond gender integration to addressing the underlying gender and social norms that cause inequalities. But more importantly, we've learned the need to look at the unintended consequences of innovations on gender relations. What happens when you commercialize indigenous vegetables? Do women still maintain control over the income from those vegetables? Are there possibilities of gender-based violence? So these are important lessons that we have learned. So this afternoon, we will explore some of the strategies that some of the projects have used in integrating gender in their work, in working with women, in addressing some of these harmful gender and social norms, the key outcomes and the lessons that they have learned. I would like to introduce the first three presenters, Ms. Ramona Ridolfi from Helen Keller International, who will speak on gender in homestead food production in Cambodia, Dr. Carrow Henry from the University of Saskatchewan, who will speak about working with women farmers in the Pulse Innovations Project in Ethiopia, and Ms. Veronica Hinojosa from Centro de Promoción Agropecuaria Campesina. I hope I got that right. Who will speak on working with women fish farmers in the Amazon Fish for Food project in Bolivia. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for your presence and attention at the very end of these two productive and interesting days. So Jemima has already set the scene, and I believe that we've already heard several times over the last couple of days the need to empower women and to integrate gender considerations within the domain of food security and nutrition. But just so we're all on the same page, how do I switch? Okay. Just so we're all on the same page, it is known that gender inequity has been found among the primary causes of maternal and child undernutrition in Southeast Asia, where HKI's project took place, and surely in other geographical contexts. Therefore, we focus on empowering women, knowing from research and program experiences that when women have higher involvement in decision-making, income, and time use, then more money goes toward the purchasing and producing of nutritious food and accessing healthcare. So how did HKI go about integrating gender aspects within the family farms project in Cambodia, which you've just heard a few minutes ago, and it was the very first video that you saw yesterday on that fish polyculture? Well, I'm very pleased to share that HKI has been taking gender integration very seriously within the organization by setting minimum standards across our program areas. So we start with formative research, most typically a qualitative assessment, digging deep in the reasons behind inequalities, their potential consequences on the health and economic empowerment of women, and also to find strategic opportunities for change and aspirations for empowerment. A 6-month-long process that involved both our research and program people in the analysis of findings, in the adaptation of a gender transformative tool that HKI started implementing in Bangladesh a few years ago, and then adopted for use in Cambodia, resulted in the implementation of a gender transformative strategy across our technical and behavior change intervention. The training of our staff, primarily on the Nurturing Connection tool, which I'm happy to talk about later on, and of other behavior change-related messaging, was followed by validation in the field, which is crucial and often a neglected step. As we implemented and rolled out the activity in the field, we also built an ongoing monitoring and supportive supervision system, which not only represented an opportunity to supervise and provide support to our staff leading the activities in the field, but also helped us ensure high-quality implementation in the field. HKI's model, where, as you've heard many times, women are the focal points for homestead food production, and with the family part of the gender transformative discussions from the Nurturing Connections curriculum, led to an increase of 10% in women's autonomy over food and cash crop farming. 79% of women became the primary decision makers, together with men, regarding major household expenditures. 72% of households considered themselves as food secure at project end versus the 26% at baseline. Qualitative assessments demonstrated also a considerable increase in men's support to domestic tasks, reducing women's time burden, especially during critical times, such as breastfeeding and postpartum, pregnancy and postpartum, allowing women more time for breastfeeding, a better preparation on infant feeding practices. The combination of increased women's decision-making, autonomy, and engagement of men has overall led to better nutrition outcomes, with an increase, as you can see, in the proportion of women able to identify iron-rich foods and sources of vitamin A. The lessons learned for us are many, but just to mention just the crucial ones. As you saw before, I mentioned that we involved both our research and project staff together across the whole formative research cycle, from the data collection to the analysis, and to adapting the tool and testing them in the field before rolling them out. And that is crucial to gain buy-in of gender and women's empowerment and overall of the gender strategy from the project team, which, as you know, it doesn't always happen. The contextual validation is crucial. Again, as I said before, it does get neglected after the training. And it's crucial because the translation into the local vernacular, Khmer, for example, in our case, and the examples that are cited for the discussions, for the role plays, and for all the sort of participatory activities are often designed in the office. And so they need to be tested for accuracy in the field. Men's engagement can be difficult and inconsistent. It requires flexible scheduling around their availability rather than the staff's or the project availability, and means sometimes working late evenings or weekends. And through ongoing policy dialogues, the project helped the Cambodian government pay more attention to gender aspects. The current food security and nutrition policy for Cambodia did not cover gender, and we are collaborating with them to have it included. And that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramona. And now, Dr. Carrow Henry.
Good afternoon, everyone. You've heard from Hussein this morning about the capacity building work that was done between two universities, Mwasi University and the University of Saskatchewan over 20 years. I'm going to tell you very quickly about the work that we have done in integrating gender, particularly women's empowerment, into this very large project. What did I do? So how do I get out of this? Perfect. All right. So the next slide talks about the challenges. And one of the things it talks about, which Jemima has already alluded to, is the enormous contributions to the economies worldwide, especially in developing countries, that women have made, and yet they are disproportionately affected by poverty, by malnutrition, and also by exploitation. You've seen at the bottom of it the quote from the late Kofi Annan, which was a champion, I believe, for women's empowerment. And Jemima spoke, of course, of Canada's feminist agenda, which also has helped us over the previous years to focus on women empowerment. I want to share with you just 4 strategies that we will use. Ours is what we call an integrative policy, and that means not on top of, but looking at ways to integrate gender into the different aspects of the program. In production, for example, women were able to receive seeds from the project, other inputs such as training, fertilizers, and with that, they were able to grow their own pulse seeds, and by pulse I'm looking at chickpeas, lentils, and beans. But one of the most important strategies that we use is the second one, and that's what's called the cluster approach. And this is where a group of women and men work together. So a cluster of 5, 1 woman, 4 men, 2 women, 3 men. And together they would work together, tilling the soil, planting, and also in reaping. We talked about the other strategy of integrating women into nutrition education and also into processing nutritious pulse product development. That was not so difficult. Everybody understood that the role of the women is to take care of the house, and so they would be the one who would go to nutrition training. What was good, though, is integrating different kind of medias in order to make that happen, because women as household, they're in the household, they needed time to do this, and so by using radio, Farm Radio International, and some of the others, we were able to do that. The very important strategy was a business model that we integrated where women worked together in groups, in cooperative, often supported by the Bureau of Women, Children, and Youth in order to provide resources and support for them. We have one of our private partner in the room, and one of the great things that we did is working with the private sector who leveraged the funds from the CIFSRF project in order for them to work with the women farmers in our community. So what did we achieve? Well, we started out thinking of 70,000 farmers. We at the first said, well, if we got to 10% women, we'd be doing good. We got to 36,000 women who participated in the many aspects of production and also in processing. We also worked with, as we said, Farm Radio International, where we were able to reach not just 135,000 households, but 246,500 households. The last one that I'll comment on is the business models, because I think this is where we had one of the greatest impact in microfinances that were developed working with the private sector and ourselves in helping women to develop small cottage business so that they were able to support themselves and also to support their families. And what has that all meant to us? Well, by helping the women, as you know, to do well, by teaching them how to take care of themselves and their family, then we saw large efforts in increased weight gain, for example, for children, and also in the knowledge and also in the behaviors for the women themselves. The stories we will tell would take us quite a lot of time, which we don't have. But I just wanted to show you that not only did we do development work, but as you can see from this slide, the research was quite robust. And that includes research in production, research in nutrition, and I heard someone talk about the socioeconomic aspect. And this was one example of how we looked at some of the socioeconomic questions and how we were able to address those. And I just want to ask my colleague Rob Norris if he will say a little bit on the project's impact.
Carol, thanks very much. You know, when we think about the work that Carol and Dr. Shalemi and the team have done over the course of 20 years, we can think about the capacity building, but some of the key outcomes, as Carol has highlighted, related to lessons learned in increasing production of pulses, increasing household nutrition, especially helping kids. When we think about making sure that we've also seen real benefits on empowering women and seeing that empowerment manifest itself in entrepreneurship, financial literacy, and playing a greater role in the regional and national economy. We see that because of the robust nature of the research. And when we think about the partnership, this partnership that has sustained many challenges and changes, we want to thank and appreciate the Government of Canada, Global Affairs Canada, and IDRC. And when we think about how this has been received, we can think about the Parliamentary Secretary just today, responsible for international development, recognizing the significance of this partnership and seeing that we are reducing poverty by empowering women and girls, and we're ready to roll up our sleeves and do this within and beyond Ethiopia as partners moving together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I would now like to call on Ms. Veronica Hinojosa from CEPAC.
Good afternoon. My name is Veronica Hinojosa, and today I want to tell you about improving gender equality in Bolivia through the Amazon Fish for Food project, or Peces para la Vida in Spanish. Peces para la Vida had 6 partners, 4 from Bolivia and 2 from Canada. Okay, yeah. Yes. In Bolivia, fish consumption is low. People eat only 2.8 kilograms per capita a year. Now you can see me. In most organizations, you can see significant inequalities between men and women. If you see the graph, the participation of women is slow, and exercise economic right is difficult. The project worked on small-scale fish farming and fisheries management to respond to this challenge. There were 3 ways we achieved results. First, we did sensitive training at multiple levels with the project team, with the associations, and 77 extension local agents. Second, we will build capacity for produce and fish through participatory research and learning. Improving women access to skill and resource was especially important. In an initial assessment, we found that 70% of the variable costs were related to an activity where women are most involved. We made policies to ensure their participation. Finally, we focus on organization strengthening. We review organizations' internal regulation to see if they promote or limit the participation of women. Also, financial literacy and leadership training help farmers understand their costs. Peces para la Vida improved equality in access. We trained farmers and technical assistance in about 50% women. 80% of the microcredit loans include women as sole or co-signer. This is a significant shift in recognizing women's roles in fish farming and her access to resources. Nearly $3 million have now been given through credit. And also, a new woman-led fish feed business is an example of innovative financing. Participation in decision-making. In 3 years, women's participation in boards of aquaculture and fishing associations increased by 28%. And women exercise their rights. Originally, only 5% of women were recognized as owners of their productive enterprise. By the end of the project, 33% were recognized officially. Lessons that we learned. In our project, we learned that we need a practical entry point. During technical or economic training, we could discuss more complicated aspects of gender roles and needs to generate sensibilities. We create policies to ensure women's participation in the training. And training helped women improve fish production, income, and nutrition. We supported them in building business. This training helped to create a strong organization to build and also to build the fish sector and influence in politics. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Veronica, and thank you all for sharing your project experiences. I think these 3 projects provide us a wide array of some of the approaches that the projects have used, from a gender transformative approach that increases women's autonomy, that starts engaging men for gender equality in terms of sharing even tasks within the household, strategies for working with women in Ethiopia to increase their access to technologies, to start businesses, all the way to Bolivia, working with women's cooperatives to increase recognition of women in aquaculture and fisheries and to get them into leadership. So thank you very much for sharing those experiences. I would now like to call upon some of our external panelists to share their perspectives. I have questions for each one of them, and I'm going to start with Dr. Frans Wong, who's Senior Advisor and Team Coordinator at the Royal Tropical Institute of the Netherlands. Frans helped us to synthesize gender within CIFSRF, and I would like to ask you, Frank, from that synthesis of the CIFSRF portfolio, analyzing the strategies that different projects used and the program as a whole, what did you find exciting? What was exciting about what we did? But also, what are some of the key gaps that you found that we need to focus on moving ahead? Frans. 5 minutes.
Yes.
I am...
Okay. Well, this is very exciting, first of all. And thanks, Jemima, and thanks, IDRC and Global Affairs Canada, first of all, for inviting KITS to undertake the synthesis and to speak today. And what I'd like to do is actually share some of the findings, which is a bird's eye view of some of the really interesting things that we found out from your project. So it's nice to see some consistency of what our presenters were providing. And sort of one of the most exciting examples is that CIFSRF is one of the sort of really good examples of consistent and systematic gender integration in the funding research cycle. Now, at the level of the program, this may not be particularly conceptually innovative. The fact that CIFSRF was able to do so consistently and throughout all of the calls for proposals, which provided some continuity over this really great mass of knowledge, it provided, you can't underestimate that. You know, a lot of the gender mainstreaming literature talks about this process of gender integration as being patchy. That's not CIFSRF. What we also found exciting is the way CIFSRF approached gender integration as a partnership of knowledge and learning. Knowledge and learning with IDRC and the grantees, among the grantees, within IDRC itself. So it really approached the gender integration as a way of developing and adopting. And when you think about the 9 years of the program and when it began and the particular Canadian government at that time and where we are today, you have to see how it evolved and adopted over time. And I think that really sets itself up for the future. And this allowed for a particular approach that was based on lessons learned. And we should see these approaches as that the projects used as a really diversity of approaches, and we saw that through the presentations. And they achieved different levels of gender outcomes, from women reached to women accessing resources and the benefits derived from those resources, and as well as women empowerment outcomes. And we saw these 3 projects are an example of that. And these different approaches we can generally categorize as those that looked at gender roles and relations and specific gender concerns, what we call content strategies, as well as they engaged with the research process itself. So gender integration was pursued through these both content and process strategies. And this was common to all projects that achieved those 3 levels of gender outcomes. For example, in terms of content strategies, they made visible the different needs and responsibilities of men and women. This is through gender sensitization, engaging men, as we heard, visibilizing women's contribution, increasing their recognition in the different roles that they're playing in food security and nutrition. Redistribution strategies that improved access to and control over resources, mainly around labor and time, but also tangible and intangible resources. And the latter is particularly important, we know from the literature of women's empowerment. That includes self-confidence, self-esteem, social networks, how you're perceived by your peers, your professional peers. And of course, there were agency strategies, women's leadership, collective action, decision-making enhancement. Social inclusion through what we were happy to see were participatory research processes and recognizing intersectionality, not treating women necessarily as a homogeneous category, but understanding how different intersecting inequalities positions them in society relative to others. And in terms of the process strategies, these included project and staff gender capacity strengthening, as we heard, gender responsive research practice, again across the research cycle, the whole research cycle. Accountability strategies, as Jemima mentioned, having gender strategies and setting targets and being accountable for those. Evidence generation strategies, such as addressing particular knowledge gaps, gender strategic questions. We also found some gaps, particularly in the context of Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy, which of course came towards the latter period of CIFSRF. And particularly in terms of the gender transformative approaches, which Jemima mentioned. What we're looking towards is a more nuanced understanding of gender as an analytical frame, particularly as gender as a social relation, moving away from the targeting of women that frames the early part of CIFSRF. a focus on the foundations, and you'll notice I'm not using the word roots, but the foundations of gender inequities, which can help us understand how we move away from a sole focus on women's empowerment to a better understanding of GTAs, or gender transformative approaches. Ultimately, this will help informing FIAP and the feminist concepts that need to be brought to bear to really understand the F in FIAP. It means many things to many people right now. And while I noted a systematic gender integration throughout the research cycle, better data is needed from which we can learn about gender transformative approaches. Better not only in terms of quality, but in terms of ability to capture the nuanced complexity of multidimensional context-specific change, which gender transformative approaches are about. So I'd like to end on that and acknowledge the other team members of the synthesis, Katrine Danielson, Dana McLaughlin, and Sylvia Sarapira, who are not with us today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Franz. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Sonia Lazlo, who's Associate Professor of Economics and Director of the McGill Institute for the Study of International Development. And what I would like Sonia to answer. So you've done research across Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, mainly on women's economic empowerment. What do you think is the major contribution of CIFSRF's work on gender to the global discourse on gender and women's empowerment? And if we were to do this all over again, what elements would you have loved to see?
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jemima, for inviting me to be part of this amazing event. And congratulations to IDRC and all the projects for an amazing body of work and projects. It's really been very exciting to see how CIFSRF has developed over these years. So thank you very much. I think these are two excellent questions. But before I answer the questions, I think it's important that we have a very short refresher of what we mean by empowerment and women's economic empowerment. It's actually a really difficult concept. I mean, something that we talk a lot about. It took Amartya Sen, Nobel Prize winner in economics, a lot of effort to try to put down the term. Naila Kabir then picked it up again in her notion of women's empowerment. And it's really about, and I think it's important that we ground ourselves in this very basic concept, which is about, very simply, well, it's a difficult concept, but if I can be very simplistic about it, is about the ability to make and act on choices, right? And so she really has three core elements of women's empowerment, which is resources, so preconditions, it's agency, it's about the process, and I'm going to come back to that because I think this is where the theory of change really does come in quite a bit, and then achievements or outcomes. What is women's economic empowerment not about? It's not about how many jobs were created. It's not about how many chickens they have more. It's not about how many sewing machines they have, right? Women's economic empowerment is about, are these good jobs? Are these jobs that allow them to balance work-life, right? Are these quality jobs? Are these jobs that allow for growth, for personal growth, for income growth, skills growth, and so on? So now coming back to CIFSRF, and in particular the fact that so many of these projects have very strong technological, innovative applications, I just sort of want to also talk briefly about what the literature has seemed to, the literature is very, very rich on the impact of whether it's training programs, microfinance, and the impact that it's had on women's economic empowerment. Recently, there's been some very good meta-analysis based on very rigorous program evaluations, trying to evaluate the impact that these projects have had on actually improving women's empowerment. And the good news is it's not a complete net negative, but the bad news is it's not a complete net positive either. In other words, that the evidence is actually quite mixed. And the reason why it's quite mixed is for a few reasons. For one, as long as these programs don't necessarily address issues that entrench even further traditional gender roles, especially around reproduction, especially around the care economy, as long as it doesn't do anything, these programs don't do anything about addressing gender norms against gender equality, those programs are going to have very limited impact. If the market opportunities aren't there to put these new skills to use, the impact in the long term just isn't going to be there. And so this is, I think, where CIFSRF has had a very interesting role to play, especially in this last phase of trying to integrate from the beginning these issues of gender. Because if we're just thinking about, all right, did we improve, how many more jobs did we create for women, how much more income and all of this sort of thing, it's not necessarily going to answer that question if we don't understand, well, what are these women able to do with that extra money? Right? Do they have the decision power over how to allocate that money according to the different resources? Are they able to assert their preferences towards reproductive choices? Are they able to assert their preferences in terms of what crops are going to get grown? That's really where this theory of change it comes in. And so I'd like to really congratulate CIFSRF's efforts and certainly the projects that were just presented in their ability to bring this theory of change within their project. Now, in terms of the second question, what would we do differently? Well, what we would do differently, I think if I had to think about what would I want in this sort of project in the future, is to do a lot more of this rigorous evaluation of what actually works. And in particular, what's very useful today is that the world of how we go about measuring and understanding women's empowerment is tremendously changing. Back when the CIFSRF project started, there wasn't a lot of very reliable measures out there to think about these things. So you guys had a really hard challenge to try to think about, how do we integrate this? It's such a hard concept. How do we measure it? How do we benchmark against it? How do we know that we've made an improvement? Well, this is what I'd do if we were to redo this exercise now, because there's so much work. So if you're working on this area and trying to think about how to integrate measurement, how to integrate evaluation, do take a look at the work that's being done in many places, the World Bank, JPAL, IDRC. There's a lot of work that's being done that really does try to address this point, and I think that's going to be very helpful for project leaders in the future. And I'm done.
Right on time. Are women better timekeepers than men? I'm beginning to think so. So my last question is to Dr. Safir Huia, who's the Gender and Social Inclusion Research Leader for the CGIAR Research Program on Climate Change, Agriculture, and Food Security. And I know, Sophia, the CGIAR is doing a lot of research on gender and food security. So my question to you is, how do the approaches that you have seen today applied by CIFSRF, how do they apply to the work that you're doing in the CGIAR? And what are some of the gaps that you're seeing that either we need to take forward or that you would be telling your colleagues, this is the body of work out there through CIFSRF, and these are some of the gaps we need to be working on.
Oops. I think maybe I'll just move this if that's all right. Thank you, Jemima, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. The last couple of days have been extremely informative, very exciting. There's so much positive action around gender and the other issues that CIFSRF has been addressing, that it's been really interesting and very impressive over the last few days, what I've seen. So, congratulations to Jemima and everyone involved in this on what you've achieved with women smallholder farmers and people at the bottom of the pyramid, so to speak. It's been great. So I don't want to repeat what my colleagues have already said, and they've said a few things already that I had been thinking. So I will just move along and mention that from my perspective of many years advocating and working for gender-responsive technology development, it's been really great to see the work that's been done in the projects around imparting knowledge to women around use of new varieties of technologies, developing technologies that are women-friendly, and that women have really been able to use these new practices and technologies to improve their lives, to increase their incomes, to contribute to their communities, and all of these forms of contribution have obviously, from what we've seen, increased their sense of confidence and contributions and have really contributed to empowerment. So that's a really positive aspect of what I've been seeing over the last few days, as well as connecting into markets. So really tangible methods and channels being opened up for women to increase their income, to develop businesses that are successful, and even to employ other members of their community. So that's been great. So some of the questions that I have, and I too will ask about gender transformative approaches. My first question is, is there a body of case studies, models that we can all learn from in terms of the approaches that have worked with women, what the results have been, the approaches that maybe have not been so successful, who are key partners, what are the methodologies, and really how are we really going to be successful in our work to encourage and facilitate gender transformation at the local level. At the CGIR, we're also struggling with that, and it would be great to talk to each other, to collaborate, to maybe coordinate our work so that we can start to understand it all a little more better and what our role could be. Some of the I don't want to say gaps, but I think these are issues for us to take into account moving forward. And I'll start with scaling. We just had a really interesting panel this afternoon on scaling. And for me, the question is, how do we ensure that scaling up successful projects that have empowered women, included women, how do we ensure that scaling up doesn't leave them behind? We've heard that scaling up can mean that things get dropped out. That things get maybe homogenized a little bit. There's not a lot of time for participatory, consultative approaches when you're doing scaling out. And really, we all know that that's how you get women's views, the views of different social groups into a project, into an initiative. So what can we do about that? And I suppose some of that may be documenting lessons learned, but I don't have the answer, but I think we need to keep that in mind. For example, information as a tool for scaling out is really important for women, but we know women don't have the same access to information and communication technologies as men do. Sometimes they have the same access to radio, sometimes not. They certainly don't have the same access to mobile phones. And when they do have access to mobile phones, we're just finding out that they're poorer quality than the ones that men tend to have. So how do we make sure that as information gets scaled out, women have the same access to the information and high quality information as well as men do? In terms of financial mechanisms for scaling out, and I see I'm almost done already, instruments like insurance, credit, so forth, again, how do you scale those out at a level that take into account the fact that women may not have the same legal right to land or credit, they may not have bank accounts, they may not have the same level of financial literacy to be able to understand, for example, why purchasing insurance will be beneficial for them, and it may not be targeted to their activities. So we need to keep those things into account. And finally, how will climate change affect all of this? Women are particularly vulnerable to climate change. We know that because they work very closely. Their activities are very close to working with natural resources, with the environment. Women and girls fetch water both for the household, but also for agriculture and irrigation. They fetch the fuel wood, the biomass for stoves and for energy. They also have agricultural plots of their own, and we've just heard, we know that they have fewer resources to support those activities. So how do we support women to adapt to the changes that climate changes and disasters might require, to respond to them, to recover from them? If it requires new seed, or does it require new forms of cropping? How do we make, or tilling, how do we make sure that women also benefit from this? And this, I think, we really need to keep in mind, because it could be the single thing that reverses a lot of the progress we've made, particularly in relation to gender equality overall, not just in relation to agriculture. And just to end, I'm going to be like a man, and I'm going to go a little over time. The other two questions I have are, what is the role of women's groups and women's organizations? And I think we've seen some really good examples here, and I really think that's a mechanism for scaling as well as for empowerment, and could combine the two. And finally, I hope that we can continue to learn together and collaborate and exchange the knowledge and the lessons that we're learning. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. I think all the panelists have definitely provided us a lot of food for thought. Please join me in thanking all of them. Just like in previous sessions, we will now go into our table discussions. The questions are the same. What is new and innovative? How will you use what you have learned in your institution and your work? What are the key gaps and steps for the future? We have about 10 minutes for the discussion, so let's get on with it. Thank you.